is synonymous with when we sing songs together, the singing part of the service. Well, certainly, worship must be more than about just attending a function. And let's hope, for hope's sake, that worship is not the same thing as singing along, or else there are a multitude of Baptists who have not worshiped God in years. The word worship actually means to kiss toward, to bow before, to express loving adoration. Those are the biblical definitions of the words used for worship. To kiss toward, to bow before, to express loving adoration. Now, all of those words exude this depth of personal appreciation and enjoyable fellowship with God Himself. They speak of a nature that says, I know Him and He knows me, and the thing that binds us together is a love that cannot be dissuaded or broken. Now, worship is something that cannot be confined to a 1 hour a week event. It is instead a lifestyle where He is all that I love and desire, foremost my priority, and He is what I think about as I walk through my days. I want to interact and encounter God. So when we gather together as an assembly to worship, what actually happens is my personal expression of loving adoration of God joins together with others' worship of God and creates an environment where the whole community of believers is overjoyed and occupied with the beauty and grandeur of God, who He is, and His work in our life throughout the week. We're just enthused that God is alive and well in our life, and that He is handling our life for us, and that He is letting us be His vessels in this world for His purposes. There is celebration. There is joy. There is exaltation. We come together and we do what the psalmist said. We ascribe to the Lord the glory due His name. We worship the Lord in the splendor of His holiness. Psalm 29 and verse 2. It is that assembled connection that speaks life and rest into weary soldiers. When you come together for this time of corporate gathered worship, if you come in your spiritual tank on empty, you should leave with it full to overflowing. It is an assembly that really brings encouragement to keep on loving Jesus with our whole heart. It is the connection of the assembled worship that speaks into my life and says, you can persevere no matter what the troubles you are facing. It's worship of God together that helps inform us that we're not in this alone, and that God is still at work through His people. Jack Hayford wrote this: when we worship, we are gathered to provide a time, a place, and a people for the Lord to manifest His glory. As we gather, it is not for a sermon, a song, or a show. We present ourselves to the Father to worship Him, providing a place for God to make an entrance among us, to save us, to shape us, and to work among us and through us. And according to that, we would have to say that we are missing out. We have grown accustomed to religious ritual. We are attending something but not encountering anyone. We are observing but not experiencing. Is that not reality? For way too many people in our day and age, church is nothing more than another meeting that makes no difference in the rest of their life. And that is not worship. I'd love for us to learn much about worship from one of the more famed passages in Scripture. If you have your Bible, you can turn to the Older Testament book of Genesis. It shouldn't be that hard to find. It's the very first book. If you'll look toward chapter 22, we're going to look into and observe Abraham's obedient response to God's testing of his faith. And what we're going to do is learn about worship from a man who is surrendering all. Genesis 22 verse 1 says this: After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. Here I am, he answered. Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. So Abraham got up in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place that God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. What's the infinitive? To worship. Have you ever considered the story of Abraham offering his son Isaac on the altar as an act of worship? Kind of puts into perspective what we commonly call worship and what reality worship should be. Inside the story, I want to very quickly give you some principles about worship that my hope is will change the way that you perceive worship, change the way that you begin to worship, change the way that you enter into times of corporate worship. We have looked at this passage and this theme before from here because it is such a great example. First principle: worship is a determined choice. Now, we live in a country that is driven by emotion. Facts no longer matter, emotions do. It does not matter what science says, what numbers say, what reality is. It only matters how I feel. It's a terrible place to live. We need to return to a healthy balance of a biblical perspective. Emotions are indeed a part of God's perfect creation and unique makeup of mankind. No doubt about it, God uses our emotions to protect us, to draw us to Himself, to help us express the depth of our needs and the gospel. Emotions are good. But emotions were intended to be servants, not masters. They are a great caboose, but a terrible engine. If you only serve, love, give, worship when you feel like it, then these things will never become a lifestyle characteristic of who you are. Do you believe that Abraham felt like walking his son Isaac up that hill? If you only worship when you feel like it, then you're going to miss out on God's activity in your life, just as Abraham would have if he was only relying upon how he felt in the moment instead of the determined choice to hear God and to do what God said. You see, worship is a choice of my will to consider and respond to the love and character of God, not because I feel like it, but because He deserves it, and I have placed worship of God as a supreme priority of my life. It's a determined choice. Number 2, worship is a surrendered trust. Now, God had given Isaac as a promised gift, and Abraham had lived in the joy of that promise for almost 30 years now. And it appeared that God was asking to take that back. What we see in Abraham, limited as his knowledge was, he did not know what the outcome of this experience was going to be. All he knew was that God said, I want you to take the blessing I've given and I want you to give it back to me on top of Mount Moriah. But what we see in Abraham is simply this. There was no part of his life that was off limits to God. By the way, Isaac demonstrated that very same surrender as well. He was quite old enough and strong enough to resist and to fight back when his father began to tie the twine around him and place him on the altar. But the text tells us nothing of Isaac's resistance. He surrendered himself as Abraham surrendered him to the Lord. If you want to experience and enjoy worship, then you cannot hold anything back from God. You are here to say, Lord, all I have is yours. I trust you completely. You have all of me. Do as you will. Now, if you come in here thinking that God is a compartment of your life and not all of your life, if you come in here trying to leverage out how you can love God and still do what you want to do at the same time, then you're not going to worship Him. You're not going to experience Him. You're not going to encounter Him in life-transforming, joy-fulfilling ways. You're just not. Because if your attention remains on what is earthly in nature, you will never see the wonder of God's provision. See, if Abraham only kept his eyes on Isaac, he would have never gone up the mountain. But his eyes looked past Isaac to the trustworthy God who is worthy of worship. Worship is a surrendered trust. Worship is also an expressed faith. Verse 5 ends in the most unique way. We know the story, right? We get the privilege of reading ahead. But all Abraham knew at the moment was that God said, I want you to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. But at the end of verse 5, look at Abraham's faith. He says to his servants, when we're done with this thing called worship, we'll come back to you. We? Abraham took a knife with wood for an altar of fire. He expected to slay his son, and yet he still encountered that event with a perspective of faith in God expressed through obedience. And Hebrews gives us some insight into how he was able to do that. Hebrews 11:17 says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, your offspring will be traced through Isaac. He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Worship is an expression of your committed faith in the nature and character of God. God, I believe you to the extent that if things seem to be contrary, I still obey you because you are God. The Bible tells us that without faith it is impossible to please God, and you need to know that applies to worship as well. We enter into His presence, trusting His promises, depending upon His character, but saying, God, before I know the end of the story, the answer of my heart is yes, Lord. Worship is also intent listening. Verse 9 of Genesis 22, when they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. He replied, Here I am. Then he said, Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. This was an environment of worship, right? The boy and I are going to go to worship. Abraham had been given instructions, and he was following those instructions, but as he was obeying, his ear was ever attentive to how God was going to speak, where God was going to lead next. And so when the angel of the Lord cried out, Abraham, he was already ready to hear. Worship involves me giving adoration to God for who He is and for what He's done, but it also involves me being open to hear what God has to say about my life for the next steps ahead. Worship is responsive because I must hear God in order to be able to obey God. And then worship is an unmistakable encounter. Verse 14, and Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all of the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command. Going forward in Abraham's life, do you think he ever doubted the Lord's provision? He stamped out, God, you are the God who provides. The ram in the thicket was caught, and Abraham knew that obedience always led to blessing, and that when I did not have all the answers, God was going to show up to make sure that the formula checked out. This is Abraham encountering God in such a way that it marked him for the rest of his life. Have you ever had an encounter with God that transformed your understanding of Him? Saw Him show up in a time where you were desperate, and He answered prayer, where He showed up and He met a need, where you were low and He infused life. Worship should be an unmistakable encounter with God. When people come into a corporate gathering and they leave saying that they have been bored to death, I wonder what they were looking at and what they were looking for. Because in the same manner that you cannot grab hold of exposed electricity and not be changed, you cannot sit in the presence of God looking unto His character and conduct and not have an unmistakable encounter that God was there. The same way that Moses at the burning bush knew this was of God. The same way that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that other man in the fire was God. Worship is about an unmistakable encounter with God. And if God is not met, it's not so much someone else's fault as it is my vision of what I came seeking. We do all of these things. Surrender. Put our faith. Look for an unmistakable encounter. We do all of these things when we sing, when we give, when we respond, when we listen, when we serve. You don't take a break from these things. It's a lifestyle. And when you're involved in this lifestyle of worship so that your service is unto Him, your giving is for the gospel, your listening is that your life might be transformed, your going is to faithfully share. When you do all of these things as worship, life becomes worship of God, and it changes who you are. And it changes what happens in this big room together. This past week I was reading in my devotional life, and I just could not help but to include it in this today. Luke 24:52 says, after worshiping Him, they, speaking of those two people on the road to Emmaus, they returned to Jerusalem. Now remember what Jerusalem was? Jerusalem was the place that put Jesus on the cross. Jerusalem was the place where persecution began to fan out against the church. They returned to Jerusalem with great joy. When your heart is principled on worship, then corporate worship is designed to send us back into the real world with great joy. Gathered worship propels you into lifestyle worship out there. Ben Patterson wrote this: occasionally I hear something like this said after a great church meeting. That was wonderful. Too bad we have to go back into the real world now. The assumption seems to be that what happened in worship was a pleasant and therapeutic diversion, and that the real thing is out there in the rough and tumble of the world. But I submit to you that it is the other way around. What was seen and felt in worship is the real thing. And the secret is for us to remember what we saw and felt when we go back into a world full of deception and lies. Gathered worship, done right, puts us as the scattered church out there with great joy and ready to tackle whatever life throws at us. Worship is one of the things that we do when we come together. And it not only helps each other, it exalts God for His great worth. Would you bow with me? I'd love this morning for you to do an evaluation of your worship. It is perfectly all right to be honest with God. And if you've gotten into a religious routine where you just attend something instead of encounter someone, when you spectate instead of participate, when you walk out of here unchanged, it's okay just to say, God, I am so sorry. I have allowed my spirituality to be dumbed down to a time of attendance instead of enlightened by an encounter with you. I've come to church, but I've missed you, and I'm sorry. I've allowed my dull worship to influence people around me, and I'm sorry. Go ahead and ask Him to lead you into personal adoration, so moving this week, so sacrificial, so faith-filled, that when you come in here, your worship overflows and ignites a passion to those around you. God, forgive us. Forgive me for treating gathered church assemblies without thought of the grandeur and holiness of who you are. Where I've thought more about people in the pew than I've thought about the one on the throne. Where I've tried to get my task done instead of spend time in your presence. Forgive me for worship that hasn't sacrificed, that hasn't been faith-driven, that hasn't looked for an encounter. Forgive me for that. God, we want our worship as a corporate body to infuse us with such joy that we leave this place excited to share who you are in the midst of our city. If you're at a place in your life where you're saying, I don't really understand how people can worship God that way. He doesn't seem real to me. It doesn't seem personal. You can have a relationship with God where He speaks into your heart by His Word and through His church, and you know it. Where you speak to Him in prayer and you know it. You can have a relationship with God that is real and personal and makes a difference in your life. If you'd like to speak with someone about how that can happen in you, step out from where you are. Make your way to the front. We'll get you into a conversation with someone that can talk with you about that. Or stay after the service and say, I really want to know how I can know God in a personal way. Simply put, it takes faith. Believing that Jesus came and died in your place for your sin, and that He is willing to forgive you if you would trust Him. And when you trust Him, that is saying, I am going to follow you as your disciple. Christianity is not saying a prayer. It is choosing to follow Jesus. It is letting Jesus live His life in you and through you. It is saying, I am no longer my own. I belong to Jesus. He is mine and I am His. If you'd like to trust Jesus today, do that and then let us know. I could have your attention this way for a moment. These are strange days. You know, we are used to welcoming people into our faith family and greeting them with handshakes and hugs and trying to remember their name and become really in tune and close. We don't do the holy handshakes anymore, and we haven't greeted each other with a kiss in several centuries. But what do we do in these days? Because there are still people that are being saved. We have a young lady that is awaiting baptism in our congregation. And guess what? I have a meeting this week with someone else that wants to know, what does baptism mean and how can I know Jesus? That's coming up this week. God's still at work. And so things are still happening. People still want to be a part of a gospel-believing, Bible-preaching, Jesus-honoring church. And so today I want to announce to you that the Herons, Pat and Laura, are coming to be a part of Calvary Family. Now this is kind of the way the formula works. If you have a family that attends Calvary, Ricky and Sarah have gone to lead at First Faith Baptist out near the Sardis Lake area. And so Ricky is pastoring First Faith. So when you lose two members of a family, they've got to recruit two more to come in and take their place. So Pat and Laura are doing that. They're sitting right back here on the Heron row. If you would like, just greet them. We will get to know them as they faithfully attend and we faithfully attend. Our lives will intertwine. So welcome them to Calvary. Also want to give you two announcements. There is an executive committee this afternoon for the Panola Baptist Association. I'll be attending that meeting. If you would like to come, you can come with me. It's at 2 o'clock. This week, we have had an opportunity fall into our lap that I'm really excited about. Someone who is in the profession of audio and video technology, as well as set building and such, event production, has moved into our area and is willing to help train us in doing our stuff better in the auditorium and by way of internet. If you would like to be trained in how you can be a part of the audio, visual, or our social media platforms getting out the gospel, we need you. So if you've got an ear and you don't mind being trained, we need more people involved so that we can meet the needs of that particular ministry on a rotation basis more often. That meeting is 4:15 on Wednesday. Be here about 4:15. It will go all the way up into our Wednesday night prayer and praise time. We're looking to really get our video sound so that the people who watch and the people who come and hear are not distracted by anything, but are able to experience time of worship. Our guys do a great job. They're just a few people, though, and we want more to be added to their tribe. So if you will be here Wednesday at 4:15 for that consultation and training. All right? Thank you so much for attending today. Next week, we revert to our routine schedule. We'll have, actually we're going to do a delay a little bit. Our small group time is going to be condensed because of the ability to, or trying to be safe in small groups within small rooms and trying not to do that for an extended period of time. So Sunday school will start, life groups will start at 9:45 and go until 10:15. So instead of a 45-minute time slot, there'll be a 30-minute time slot, 9:45 to 10:15, and then worship service will start here at 10:30. All right, so kind of back to our normal schedule. except for our small group, life group time will be 9:45 to 10:15, and then worship service at 10:30. All right? You'll get information about that through email and social media platforms this coming week as we try to manipulate our schedule to meet needs. Have a great week in Christ. I pray the Lord's blessing on you. Adults, you will still be in here for that life group time. Children, student ministry, college will all be in their separate settings next Sunday. Have a great week in Christ.